My producer Robin Scholes had acquired the rights to the novel and had commissioned a screenplay from the novelist. So I came aboard in the early stages with great reluctance actually, because even though I was looking for a feature film project and very happy making commercials and wanted to break out into making a feature film, I actually didn't think this one was going to be the one to do it, because I thought it would end my career as a film director very quickly, actually, and I mean that. Not that it did, in fact the opposite happened, but you know, the rest is history. The financing back in the 90s was pretty much all by the Film Commission. There were no independent investors. What it had going for it was that it was a hugely successful novel, but only successful so far. White, upwardly mobile, middle-class New Zealanders were reading it. Maori and Polynesians were not. But it did have some cachet, and people thought that it would make a good film. The Film Commission was split evenly, right down the middle. There was a kind of a bunch of new brooms, younger generation people on the commission who wanted it made and felt that it should be made. There was an older, more entrenched section of the Film Commission that felt that it was, not that it shouldn't, but it was too hard and too troublesome. And they'd just been burnt by a film by Barry Barclay had made called Te Rua. Barry Barclay was a very gifted Māori filmmaker, and he'd made Ngāti and a bunch of other stuff. And he had made Te Rua, and it had not worked out, and it caused great friction within the Film Commission. And it allowed an atmosphere to develop whereby anything with Māori was seen to be, you know, hands off, too hard, put it in the too hard basket. So we had to battle long and hard to kind of get it across the line. It was not an easy thing to convince the Film Commission to fully back it. But we got it there in the end. Strange enough, my DP, Stu Drybrough, had introduced me to it about a year beforehand and said this would make a great film. We sat around and talked about it, and I read it and I said this would be the worst film ever. I said not only would this make a terrible film, I said it would end all our careers. Because it was about drugs, violence, alcohol, suicide, death, child abandonment, seemed to be beating up on Māori. I thought it was too grim an exercise to make into a film. That's when I read the literature. Robin, of course, came to me about a year later, had acquired the rights to it and asked me if I'd be interested in making it, and I told her the same thing. I said, look, you know, I think you're on a hiding to nothing with a film like this. And she said, she kept on at me like a dog with a bone, you know, like, just reconsider, maybe what would you do different, blah, 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 blah. And in the end I thought, well, I sort of, you have to examine yourself and go, well, look, you want to make a film. B, you want to make a good film. C, why not take the toughest, hardest subject in the world and see if you can make a good film out of it. If you can't, you'll fail spectacularly. No one will ever know because no one will see it anyway. You've got a good career making commercials. You can slink off back to making commercials and no one will know, be any the wiser. So, you know, in the end I had to step up to prove to myself that instead of bleating on about making the great New Zealand film or whatever, you better get stuck in and do it. So I became my own biggest critic, really. So I was very aware that what we were going into was a piece of hard-hitting social realism. But if I made it like a Ken Loach film or a Mike Leigh film, I didn't think people would stay in the audience. I didn't think people would stay in there at all. I think you'd lose people after the first half hour. So I decided to dress up my sort of quasi-Ken Loach, Mike Leigh picture and dress it up in a cinematic gloss.
What's the time, Mr. Wu? What's the time? What's the time, Mr. Wu? What's the time?
And secondly, I knew that the editing of it had to be substantially different. That the editing had to be really fast and furious, and the reason for that was to keep the audience glued to their seat so that they had no chance to leave the theatre. Combining all these different cinematic styles, it's kind of heretical to the idea of social realism, but I didn't care. I was playing with genre specifics and trying something new, and I didn't know whether it would work. I thought it was heresy myself, but I instinctively knew that if we could make it an attractive looking film for people to look at subconsciously or subliminally, and then edit it really fast, it would still be a sort of a high class, high quality type of social realism. Anyway, it seemed to work out because the results seemed to bear fruit in that respect anyway. Well, the casting was critical to a story like this, and in many ways there's a trick going on in this casting. The book is ruthless, brutal and unforgiving. Has Māori gangs in it, and Māori gangs of the day and to this day are brutal, unattractive, unappealing, quite vicious, and I didn't want to impose that on the film. It was going to be a tough enough sell anyway because white Pākehā audiences were going to validate their long-held suspicions that Māori were a bunch of losers and had no other attributes other than to join gangs and be on social welfare, and I didn't want that because I knew a different story than that. However, if we were going to tell the story, we had to deal with alcohol, violence, alienation, social welfare dependency, brutality, gangs, etc. So I went out of my way to make the cast look as good looking as possible. By that I meant I was going to have Māori look attractive even though they were in a state of depravity and despair. And I think I succeeded in that, and it was a tricky road to travel. Rena is beautiful in a certain fashion, in an Ana Mañani fashion, very realistic. And I really wanted that look for her. Mamangaroa had a timeless beauty to her. She was extraordinary. When I first saw her, she was cast out of a whangare high school reluctantly, and she seemed to epitomise everything I'd seen from old photography of Māori from my parents and grandparents and great-grandparents' generation, and she was timeless. And then people like in the gang, well, let me talk about Jake. I mean, of course, Temuera was a very handsome guy, very good looking, but of course I needed him to be handsome for two reasons. He needed to be very good looking, and you need to understand why she stayed with him, because he was a monster. And so he needed to be an attractive brute, and I think we succeeded in that. He certainly did anyway. But when it came to things like the gang, if you look closely at the gang, they're all incredibly well buffed, and we cast them out of gyms, and we went all over South Auckland looking for the best looking guys with the best physiques we could find. And they were really good looking guys, and I think I did a disservice to the reality of gangs, but I didn't care. I wanted it to be a hybrid gang which has never been seen before and actually doesn't exist in this country and never will exist in this country. It was a martial arts gang who was covered with tā moko, which was very new in those times, half completed moko, and a lot of tattooing going on. But a lot of the tattooing that we put on those gang members was a very fundamental, old school moko dressed up with a new style of tā moko, not the sort of brutish mongrel mob type of tattoos that you see these days. So there was a lot of tricks going on in the casting to make this, and remember that the casting was all Māori. I think there's only 2 or 3 Pākehā in the whole film, and there are 2 cops and 1 judge. And that's very deliberate, because I wanted the audience to identify with those who were in front of them, who were all Māori. So you had no chance to say, oh, I identify with those Pākehā or those European-looking faces there. So you have to go with the people that you see in front of you, and then you relate to them more and sympathise and empathise with those characters more. So it's a kind of a psychological trick, but I think it worked. In fact, I know it did, really, because the results speak for themselves, I guess.
You like your pretty boy face. Calling Michael Jackson. Said we'll rearrange it for free.
We had no money, very little money. And we had to make every day count. We couldn't go shoot a day, or we couldn't even shoot half a day more than we wanted to. So, but I was quite used to that. I had grown up as a technician on very low budget movies, because that's what New Zealand filmmaking was and still is, this sort of so-called independent film structure. You learn very quickly how to spend money wisely and how not to waste money, and having worked in commercials which have, they're not profligate, but you have higher budgets and more money to spend, I knew that we only had X amount of money and X amount of days to shoot this film in. So, but I'd become very good at marshalling my own forces around shooting it. If we had 36 days, I believe we did, maybe 35, but I had to shoot it in that. So I meticulously, with my assistant directors and production crew, crafted every single day along those lines with no wastage anywhere. It had to be shot in sort of 10-hour days or 11-hour days in 35 days, and you couldn't afford. So that meant if you wanted to shoot 33 setups and you only ended up shooting 14, you had to shoot the day's work in 14 setups, or 3 or 1. But that was the way we got through it, and that meant that you didn't have to worry, and production didn't have to worry about falling behind and running out of money. But it was a very tight little number. But I won't say it was plain sailing. We encountered a lot of problems, but no more so or no worse than any other production, I think. Of course, 25 years dims the memory. If there was any ghetto in Auckland, it was in South Auckland. Not necessarily, you had to go across the Mangere Bridge to really get into it. But I mean, it seems a little unfair to stigmatise South Auckland in such a fashion. But back then in the late 80s, early 90s, Auckland's much more vast now. But there's still large areas of welfare dependency and poverty, and unfortunately a lot of it is Māori, Polynesian. I was aware of it, had been amongst it, but not spent a lot of time amongst it because I didn't know anybody from that area. When I came to make the movie, you have to immerse yourself in the environment, and I chose to make it a South Auckland environment rather than in Rotorua where the novel is set. I didn't want to get into that small city environment, the Gisbornes, the New Plymouths, the Rotoruas of the world. I wanted to set it in our largest New Zealand city. So we went looking, really. And we based ourselves as a production office in Onehunga, and then we wanted to find places as close to that as possible, so we could limit our travel. So we found a lot of it in this wider circle. You didn't want to travel outside the circle too much, and that allowed us to get into Otara and Papatoetoe and other places with, the pub. The big pub was actually some old warehouse converted into a bottle store, which, we just found things and made them into what we wanted to make them into very cheaply. The pub interior was in the production office building downstairs in the basement, and it was just the basement of a building, and which my production designer designed into a bar for something like $2,000, because he just made it into a dark space with bar leaners and a bar, and it's amazing what you can get away with when you've got very little money. But that became our bar after work as well. So.
Forget it, lady. You looked better before you turned around. Look, boy, you're too much. You want to be like your man, eh? Learn how to stand on your own 2 feet.
I tell stories, and I'm a great student of history, and I think all our history must be told in one form or another, both Pākehā and Māori. The story of New Zealand is one of conquest and land theft and brutality and warfare, much like many other nations. And a lot of people, both Pākehā and Māori, like to diminish that and like to gloss over those histories and those stories by putting a fresh coat of paint on their own culture. And when it came to Once Were Warriors, I knew what it was. And the novel, remember, was not being read by Māori, and it was not being read by Polynesians at all, but it was being read by Pākehā New Zealand. And it wasn't being read by those people to validate their views of Māori already. It was this kind of searing indictment, and it was tearing the scab off. It was an inside look at something that people didn't know about, but Alan Duff had written about because he came from it and wrote about it very eloquently. And but even when I read it, I thought, this is a hell of a beat up on Māori. But it's an accurate one, because it's coming from an author's own experience. I didn't think it was coming from his imagination. I didn't believe that he'd made it up. In fact, if he had made it up, people would have been on his case, and they would have discovered that he had made it up, and it was not a true experience. So it was okay as a novel, and it was accepted as a novel because it was a true experience that he had lived through. So, but I knew film was a different animal, and people go to see films for entertainment value, not for polemical or for reasons they don't want to be instructed or have history lessons or have social commentary thrust down their throat. And I knew where people would come after us. I knew the Māori community, a certain aspect of Māori would come after us. And I said, look, you can't shrink from telling these stories because of these reasons. You're going to, in fact, I ended up embracing, I said, I'm happy to embrace any criticism that comes my way. If I've done a good job, if I've done a proper job of this film, and the film will speak for itself. If I haven't, if I've made a disaster and a beat up on my own culture, then I deserve all the brickbats that'll come my way. And I did get a lot of top level criticism before the film was made, as it was being shot, and after it came out. And I fully expected it, but a very strange thing happened. The film was not the failure that I thought it would be. When I mean failure, I thought it would be a failure then that people would not want to spend money and come and see this picture. But the reverse happened, and people came to see it in large numbers, and especially Māori came to see it in large numbers, which then put the lie, I won't say it's a lie, but it dampened the criticism that was levelled at the picture. And you've got to remember, with some fairness, a lot of Māori, especially academics and people who have Māori academics, were trying to counter a lot of Pākehā argument. Māoris are lazy, they're in prison because they deserve to be, they beat up their kids because they don't know any better. It's a facetious argument, but it was constantly being bolstered by welfare statistics, prison statistics of the day. And a lot of Māori academics were trying and doing a good job to counter those statistics in an open forum. And my film comes along and just about destroys all that overnight. But it did another thing, beyond that, which is a criticism which is fair and honest from those people, from those quarters. I still think, and I believe many of those people re-evaluated their argument upon reflection, upon watching that film, because it's a fair and balanced assessment of what that world is like, and that world can be reflected in any culture. And I've travelled the world with that film, and it's the same in Ireland and in Latin America and in South Africa and in China. And the story is the same. All cultures are capable of this when they are left to this, and when there's no work and the husband, the breadwinner, is reduced to an alcoholic shell of his former self and takes that out on his family, etc., etc., etc. And I think there's a reality and a truth behind the film, even though it's a fiction, that counters the criticism that was levelled at us. I mean, to this day I'm sure there's some people that hate the film for what it projects about Māori, but I think it also projects another side, a love of the culture, and a love of a culture that once was, and strives very hard to put that across in the arena that is filmmaking. And we did some good things with that film, I know we did, and I won't crow on about it, but it's an accurate criticism and on reflection. No, you should never shy away from difficult subjects. I mean, that's the coward's way out. Most films are made for entertainment value, you know, Marvel comic movies, 98% of films you go to see. Filmmaking is very expensive. Investors have to recover their costs. They make films for entertainment value. But that doesn't mean to say a Scarface can't be made. You know, a brutal, uncompromising, outrageous outlaw movie about a gangster with no redeeming features whatsoever who ends up, you know, becoming the cocaine king of America. And yet it becomes a great cult classic, and it's a hard subject, and people hated it at the time. Many people, including critics, hated it at the time. Once for Warriors is no different. There's many films I could quote chapter and verse that people think that why on earth was this film ever made? And yet they've become great favourites of audiences. It's mostly the province of documentarians to take on hard subjects. It's also the province of dramatic filmmakers, and they should take them on, and because it shines a light into the corners of the darker aspects of each other's culture, and it can be quite awakening, actually.
Telling me in my own house who I can and can't have here. Well, I've asked them back tonight, and you better be ready for it. Do you hear me?
One of the most telling ones was the novel is written as a first-person narrative. It's inside the head of the male protagonist, Jake Hickey. All the dialogue comes from his own thoughts. There's not a lot of third-person dialogue from other characters. And so the novel is driven by Jake Hickey. It's all about him. And the women in the story, his daughter especially and his wife, are secondary characters to his being, his drive, his ego. If I followed that narrative, the film would not work the way I had envisaged it working. By that I meant what I did was I hired a woman friend of mine who was a playwright, a Maori playwright, to rewrite Alan's screenplay, or to have a new, fresh approach at it. The reason for that was I wanted a woman's perspective on the story. There was already a woman's perspective in the novel, but we had to take it and re-engineer it, rejig it, so the entire thrust of the screenplay was from the woman's perspective, from the daughter's and the mother's perspective. Because I knew that Jake Hickey, the father's perspective, the male perspective, in fact all male perspectives in the film, would drive through that screenplay like a truck, because they were so powerful, violent, dominant, etc. And that was a great way of levelling out and balancing out the story. So subliminally the story is told from a feminine perspective. A mother trying to save her family from destruction, and a young girl's baffling bewilderment as why her father is the way he is, as she tries to navigate her way through an emerging life or a future that's very bleak and has not much future for her. And so what happened when audiences embraced the film, by far and away the largest audience was with women. Young women as well, but by larger numbers, adult women, and even 20s, and the demographics increased when you got into women of their 30s and 40s, mothers especially. Another thing happened was that people of my mother's generation, women in their 60s at the time and their 70s, were going to it, and these were Pākehā women as well, were going to it in great numbers and increasing numbers. And we started to unlock a lot of these demographics because I was working very closely with one of the top agencies of the day, Saatchi and Saatchi in Wellington, who helped me immeasurably with the release of the film. And they had tracking mechanisms which they were able to figure out that several things were happening. Women were going to refuges in larger numbers because of the film. They were spiking. And women were going to see the film because people of my mother's generation were able to talk about it with what had happened to them. It wasn't just something that was happening to Māori. Sexual violation of young women was not something confined to Māori and Polynesian communities. It's still not, and it happened in Pākehā communities as well. So within my mother's generation, they hid it and buried it under the rug as well, and they were able to talk about it, but they had to go with friends of theirs who were of the same generation. They couldn't go on their own, but they went like in their 2s and 3s, and it was quite a remarkable transition. Men went to see the film as well, but they came away far more troubled about it, because what men would see, which I saw myself, any man I talk to who has seen that film sees it in himself. He sees a version of himself that he could become. Some men will go along and see that film and see the version of themselves that they are. And they will either accept it or deny that they are that person. But many of us know that we can become that person. So we strive to be better men and not become that person. And so we all take a different thing from it. So I think it unlocked an aspect of viewing ourselves under a microscope. And so I think the more that people saw it, the more people talked, it became a film that was promoted word of mouth. And by far the country where it had its greatest success was one where I expected it to have its least success, which was Australia, for reasons which are still unfathomable to me. And it's not about the validation of Australians seeing Maori as the way they view them. Most people that saw that film were, of course, white Australians, but there was a huge success amongst the art film circuit in Australia. And I think that people saw it for what it was, which was a kind of slice of New Zealand social realism that reflected their culture as well. So it was crossed the gender divide as well. Moved from an independent filmmaking environment, low budget, to a high-end studio filmmaking environment, which is high budget. And the differences are obvious, but many things are exactly the same. You still have to be responsible for a budget. You have to shoot it within that budget. But you do have the luxury of things do run over budget. There is money to spare. It's not always to spare, but you can find resources, meaning money, to complete the picture. unlike a picture like Once Were Warriors, which had no more money. You couldn't go and ask anyone for any more because it didn't exist. I actually never pursued the grand action formula of the Bond movies and the XXX movies. My agent called me one day and said, would you like to do a Bond movie? And I said yes. Having made the Bond movie, you suddenly get pigeonholed and you're suddenly that guy who can make the big action films. So I moved, I immediately became the guy who could direct those type of films and made the XXX franchise. But I didn't want to be that guy, and I actually went to America to make the high-end dramatic American film, The Edge, or Mulholland Falls, and things like that. But that era was passing into television. That's when I started tinkering with The Sopranos in the late 90s, etc., etc. Which is why I went to Europe and made Devil's Double. And big, large-scale action epics are fantasies of a sort that no one can really... It's not a reflection of any reality that exists. But it's a style of filmmaking, nor is a Roman, nor is Cleopatra. It's just a reflection of somebody's version of history, and it's a big spectacular. It's great to look at things like that and reflect on what they might be. So they're enjoyable to make, but I much prefer the environment of working in human dramas. But I also like to have them to have an element of action within them, because I think action drives filmmaking along. It's not necessary, it's just my particular desires. I like to keep the film going with a certain action and pace. That's why there's a car chase in Mahana in the first 5 minutes.
Our people once were warriors, but not like you, Jake. They were people with mana, pride, people with spirit.
I think it's a testament to the world that we created around it, that there's not a lot, especially to the things that give you away in films in a period of time, is the hair and makeup and costumes and the cars and the environment. Well, the environment was a poor South Auckland environment, which is kind of a bit timeless. The cars give it away for sure, but the hair and makeup does not at all. In fact, if you look at it, it could be, a lot of it could be right now. The hair and makeup is timeless, and so the costumes are, we made up all the costumes, and they don't give it away either, because there's no costuming that says, oh, that's a real 80s or 90s look, because we strove at the time not to do that. So I think it holds, and the music's, even though the music is a kind of hip-hop South Auckland 90s environment, it's still around today, and it's still some pretty legendary tracks in there. So it holds up, which I'm very proud of. But it dates in some other ways.
Let's go, son.
No, I wouldn't go back, even if I was given the chance. I was only ever interested in telling one story, and that was that my story that I told was an open and closed, finished subject. So even though I admired the others for finding a way to do a sequel in Broken Hearted, I was not interested in Jake Hickey's journey, and I was not interested in a sequel. To my mind, he had destroyed his life and his work and his family, and I didn't think there was any redemption or any comeback from that. It's no reflection upon the film that was made after, or any other films that will be made about Jake Hickey, but that's just my view of it, and that's the only thing I wanted to do, and I didn't want to go back to that world and won't. Someone else can, with my blessing, but not me.